On September 11th, 2001, this is what we all saw. All of us, across all political, cultural, and religious spectra, watched the worst thing many of us had ever seen. Together. But in what now seemed like less time than it took to wipe away our tears, the same depraved thugs who sponsored 8 years of Clinton-murdered Vince Foster hysteria began hijacking our pain and our patriotism to serve their partisan interests right before our eyes. The minute the Bush administration began trying to stretch the war they got into an excuse for the war they wanted, 9/11 stopped being merely a national tragedy and started being the Bush administration's bottomless political ATM machine. The minute the party of personal responsibility began using the mantra 9/11 changed everything as the political equivalent of the blood of Christ, as a means to absolve themselves of their personal responsibility for 8 years of malice and derangement, for them, September 11, 2001 stopped being a moment of shared national anguish and started being a suit of cultural body armor, which magically deflected any criticism of their lies and their hypocrisy, an impervious sniper's nest from which they could cynically escalate their war on the left. Or don't you remember the day the right robbed the graves of all those who perished on 9/11 to turn this into their all-purpose get-out-of-the-90s free card? And the thing is, it worked. By selling 9/11 for a mess of wingnut pottage, the right bought itself an anti-liberal free-fire zone and 2 presidential terms worth of blank checks, 2 terms of an alternately supportive and supine media, 2 terms of catastrophe, corruption, and treason, protected from scrutiny by an ablative shield made out of solid "Why do you hate America?" and a promise that they could go on barebacking diseased monsters in the alley all night long, every night forever, and wake up each morning miraculously clean, virginal, and still beloved in the eyes of God. But they forgot that Tempest just keeps fusioning along, and as time passed, the right got so accustomed to butt-scooting their depravity all over the public square and never being called on it, they simply stopped noticing that they were amassing a whole new post-9/11 public record, so despicable and overflowing with conservative atrocities that it positively dwarfed their antics during the Clinton years. And that brutal, meth-addict level of dependence on never being taken to task for anything they say or do left the right completely unprepared for the one thing their leaders promised would never happen again: losing. And losing has driven them a special kind of crazy, that screaming incoherently and lashing out in every direction kind of cold-turkey, junkie withdrawal crazy. Since the 2008 election, they have emptied out their entire store of raving invective and delusion. Losing has left them insisting that the legally elected President of the United States somehow isn't really the President, that he is a secret enemy, a communist, a Hitler, a Muslim sleeper cell, a Chicago gangster, has left them swearing that their country has been stolen, and that somewhere hidden in secret code in a 1,000-page healthcare bill is a plan to murder senior citizens. To understand how deep and relentless their addiction goes, consider the example of Katie Abram, who leaped into micro-celebrity in the wingnut pantheon last year with her "I don't want my country to become Russia" speech. Katie Abram wanted the world to believe that, like a wingnut sleeping beauty, she somehow slept through 9/11, slept through 2 wars and the $2 trillion bill they racked up, slept through tax cuts for the wealthy that added another few $1 trillion to our debt, slept through Katrina, slept through Terry Schiavo, slept through the screams of the Constitution, as the Bush administration fed it an inch at a time through the wood chipper, the same Constitution she was now so deeply concerned about that she somehow became, virtually overnight, an original intent quote-spewing expert, only to be awakened in a sudden patriotic fury by the sound of a black Democrat taking the oath of office. I'm sure in Mrs. Abrams' mind, and in the tiny little minds of tens of millions of Americans just like her, she sees absolutely no contradiction between explaining that she never paid any attention to a single news item prior to January of 2009, and saying that she started paying attention in 1991 when we first went to the Gulf War, and that she has debated politics with friends at the opposite end of the political spectrum 1,000,000 times over. It is, in fact, a sign of the depth and effectiveness of their brainwashing that people like Mrs. Abrams see no conflict between saying, "I have never been interested in politics" in one breath, and "I always seem to have faith in government" in the next. Because during the Bush years, people like Mrs. Abrams never saw their love of their dear leader and their fealty to his administration as something political. They saw it as normal, as the universe being at its proper wingnut default setting. White male, fundamentalist Christian, conservative, flight suit clad, and killing scary brown people. And as long as that remained true, all was right with the world. And people like Mrs. Abrams were absolved by their don't-worry-go-shopping leaders of any responsibility for paying attention to anything their government was actually doing. And once the dear leader's reign ended, as far as people like Mrs. Abrams were concerned, the natural order of mindless obedience in exchange for a smug and blissful ignorance collapsed. Their country was suddenly broke and screwed up for reasons they dared not think about too much. Their country was suddenly awash in dirty effing hippies, who for some reason were no longer satisfied with being cultural punching bags. Their country suddenly had politicians and activists who said mean things about their dear leader and the Republican Party and got away with it. And worst of all, their country suddenly had a scary black man living in their dear leader's pretty White House, probably having dirty Muslim sex in their dear leader's sacred Christian bed and putting his filthy Kenyan hands all over their country's pure white constitution. So, for example, when you hear of the same people who fanatically supported President George W. Bush when he famously told Iraq war critics to go to hell, well, we had an accountability moment, and that's called the 2004 election. Now insisting, during the healthcare debate, for example, that President Barack Obama needed to scrap the current grandiose plan to start over. Or when you see the mobs on the right being whipped by talk of secession or revolution or spilling the blood of tyrants into a nearly pornographic frenzy, understand that what you are witnessing are the echoes of political decisions made in the wake of September 11th, 2001. Political decisions that trained the right to believe, on a visceral level, that a sufficiently bloody and horrifying disruption to the life of this country can, if properly exploited, wash away their 8 otherwise unforgivable years of sin and restore their country to its proper wingnut default setting. That if the right sacrifices are made to the right gods in just the right way, they can be virgins again.
After they drove the car into the ditch, made it as difficult as possible for us to pull it back, now they want the keys back. No! You can't drive. We don't want to have to go back into the ditch. We just got the car out.